When 16-year-old Mercy Holloway's own sisters sold her to a stranger for $50 in the Wyoming Territory of 1869, they called her too scarred and ugly to ever deserve love or happiness. Discarded like damaged goods and shipped off to work for a mysterious widower and his grieving young daughter, Mercy believed she was destined to remain invisible forever. But as she slowly begins to heal the broken family she's been thrust into, something unexpected starts to bloom. Not just in the little girl who begins calling her Mama Mercy, but in the quiet, devastatingly kind man who sees past her scars to the woman beneath. What happens when the sisters who threw her away discover that the ugliest sister has become the most beloved? The metal horseshoe whistled through the air like a deadly bird, striking 16-year-old Mercy Holloway square in the face with a sickening crack that echoed across the Wyoming Territory prairie. Blood poured from the gash that split her left cheek, mixing with the dust and tears as she lay crumpled beside the fallen mare that had kicked her. Above the ringing in her ears, she could hear her sisters screaming. Not for her, but for their parents who lay motionless beneath the overturned wagon. That was 3 years ago, in the autumn of 1866, and Mercy still woke some mornings touching the thick rope of scar tissue that ran from her temple to her jaw. The wound had healed crooked, pulling one corner of her mouth into a permanent half-frown that made strangers look away quickly. But the deeper wounds, the ones left by losing her parents and watching her sisters grow cold toward her, those still bled fresh every day. Mercy Elizabeth Holloway, get away from that window this instant. Victoria's sharp voice cut through the morning silence like a whip crack. At 22, Victoria had inherited their mother's copper hair and emerald eyes, along with a beauty that made men stumble over their own boots when she walked down Main Street in Cheyenne. Mr. Henderson will arrive any moment, and I won't have you frightening him off with that face. The words hit harder than any horseshoe ever could. Mercy pressed her palm against the cool glass, watching a dust devil spin across the endless grassland that stretched toward the horizon. Out there, somewhere beyond the golden waves of prairie grass, there had to be a place where scars didn't matter, where a girl's worth wasn't measured by the smoothness of her skin. Really, Mercy, added 19-year-old Constance, her voice softer but no less cutting. She stood before the cracked mirror, pinching her cheeks to bring color to them. Constance possessed a gentler beauty than Victoria. Brown curls that caught the light just so, and delicate hands that could embroider flowers so real they seemed to bloom right off the fabric. It's unseemly how you hover about when we have gentlemen callers. Surely you understand that your condition makes things awkward for everyone. Mercy's fingers found the scar automatically, tracing its familiar ridge. Your condition, as if being kicked by a horse was something shameful she'd brought upon herself. As if the mark on her face somehow reflected a darkness in her character rather than simple bad luck. The cramped adobe house felt smaller every day, especially when her sisters filled it with their preparations for suitors. Victoria had claimed the only real bedroom after their parents died, while Constance took the small alcove behind the kitchen. Mercy slept on a bedroll in the corner of the main room, surrounded by the ghosts of their former life. Their father's pipe still resting on the mantel, their mother's sewing basket gathering dust in its usual spot. Perhaps you could visit Mrs. Grayson today? Victoria continued, not looking at Mercy as she adjusted her blue silk dress, the finest thing any of them owned. She mentioned needing help with her washing. Translation: disappear until the important business was finished. Mercy had heard this suggestion countless times over the past year as Victoria entertained a string of potential husbands. Each man who crossed their threshold received the same treatment: warm smiles for Victoria, polite acknowledgement for Constance, and carefully averted eyes for Mercy. Victoria, Mercy said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, why do you hate me so much? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. For a moment, Victoria's perfect composure cracked, and something raw flickered across her features. Guilt, perhaps, or the ghost of the sister she used to be before survival became more important than love. I don't hate you, Victoria replied finally, but her eyes remained fixed on her reflection. I simply refuse to let your misfortune drag the rest of us down into poverty and spinsterhood. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made all three sisters freeze. Through the thin walls, they could hear the jingle of expensive harness and the creak of a well-made carriage. Mr. Henderson had arrived, and with him came the possibility of salvation, at least for two of the Holloway sisters. Mercy caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror as she moved toward the door. The scar pulled her face into an expression that looked perpetually sad, even when she wasn't. Her brown hair hung limp around her shoulders, and her gray dress, the only decent one she owned, had been mended so many times it looked more like a patchwork quilt than proper clothing. "Remember," Victoria hissed as the carriage wheels crunched on the gravel outside. "Not a word unless spoken to directly, and for heaven's sake, try to keep that side of your face turned away." Mercy nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She understood her role perfectly, to be invisible, to fade into the background like furniture, to pretend she didn't exist so her sisters could shine brighter by comparison. But as she watched Victoria smooth her skirts one final time, Mercy couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change forever. The air itself seemed charged with possibility and danger, like the moments before a prairie thunderstorm when the wind stops blowing and every creature holds its breath. Mr. Henderson's knock echoed through the house like a judge's gavel, and Mercy pressed herself against the wall as Victoria swept toward the door. Whatever happened next, she knew with bone-deep certainty that by sunset, nothing would ever be the same. Mr. Gerald Henderson filled their tiny doorway like a well-dressed mountain, his bulk straining against an expensive wool suit that probably cost more than the Holloway sisters spent on food in 6 months. His thick mustache twitched as his small, calculating eyes swept over the modest room, taking inventory of every stick of furniture, every frayed curtain, every sign of their desperate poverty. "Miss Victoria," he said, removing his hat with a flourish that might have seemed gallant if not for the predatory gleam in his gaze. "You look absolutely radiant this morning." Victoria's curtsy was perfect, practiced to the point of artistry. "Mr. Henderson, what an honor to have you visit our humble home." Mercy watched from her corner as Henderson's attention moved to Constance, who blushed prettily and lowered her eyes in the way their mother had taught them. Demure but not cold, interested but not eager. Henderson's smile widened, clearly pleased with the selection before him. Then his gaze found Mercy. The change in his expression was immediate and brutal. His eyes narrowed with disgust, and he actually took a half-step backward as if her scars might be contagious. The silence stretched like a taut rope until Mercy felt her cheeks burn with shame. "I wasn't aware you had another sister," Henderson said slowly, never taking his eyes off the damaged side of her face. "Oh, that's just Mercy," Victoria laughed, the sound brittle as breaking glass. "Pay her no mind. She was just leaving to help Mrs. Grayson with her chores." But Henderson held up one meaty hand, his merchant's mind clearly working through some complex calculation. "Actually, Miss Victoria, her presence here is quite fortuitous. You see, I've come today not merely to court, but to discuss a business proposition that could benefit us all." Mercy felt ice water flood her veins. Something in Henderson's tone, the same voice he probably used when buying cattle at auction, made every instinct scream danger. "A business proposition?" Constance asked, tilting her head like a curious bird. Henderson settled his considerable bulk into their father's old chair, which creaked ominously under his weight. From his jacket, he produced a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. More money than the Holloway sisters had seen since their parents' death. "Ladies, I'll speak plainly," he began, his eyes moving between Victoria and Constance while carefully avoiding Mercy entirely. "I am a man of considerable means looking to establish a proper household. I have need of a wife, a beautiful, accomplished woman who can grace my table and bear my children." Victoria's breath caught audibly. This was the moment she'd been preparing for, the golden opportunity that would lift her out of poverty and into the ranks of Cheyenne's society wives. "However," Henderson continued, "I find myself in the unusual position of being equally charmed by both you and your sister Constance. Such beauty, such refinement. How does a man choose between two such perfect flowers?" Mercy bit her tongue so hard she tasted blood. perfect flowers. As if she weren't even in the room, as if she were already dead and buried. "You're too kind, Mr. Henderson," Victoria murmured, though her eyes had sharpened with competitive calculation. She'd spent 3 years positioning herself as the family's best hope for rescue, and she wasn't about to lose that advantage to Constance. "Which brings me to my proposition," Henderson said, hefting the coin pouch so it jingled meaningfully. "I propose to marry one of you, my choice, naturally, after a proper courtship period. But first, we must address the impediment to establishing a respectable household." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Mercy's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized where this conversation was heading. "Impediment," Constance whispered. Henderson's gaze flicked to Mercy like a man eyeing a bothersome insect. "Your sister's condition would make things quite awkward for a man in my position. The wives of my business associates, the social gatherings, the charitable functions, well, you understand." "What are you suggesting?" Victoria asked, but her tone suggested she already knew. "I happen to know of a man in need of domestic help," Henderson said smoothly. "A recent widower with a young child. Someone who wouldn't be particular about appearances, given his own reduced circumstances. I would be willing to arrange this placement, and naturally, compensate you for the inconvenience of separation." The words hit Mercy like physical blows. They were discussing her future as if she were livestock to be sold, a problem to be solved, a burden to be transferred from one household to another. "How much?" Victoria asked. The question came so quickly, so eagerly, that even Henderson looked slightly surprised. Mercy felt something inside her chest shatter like dropped glass. $50, Henderson replied. "Quite generous, considering." "Victoria," Mercy whispered, finding her voice at last. "You can't be serious." But Victoria's eyes had taken on the hard glitter of desperation and greed. $50 was more money than they'd see in years of scrimping and saving. It was freedom from poverty, from uncertainty, from the daily reminder of everything they'd lost. "It's for your own good, Mercy," Victoria said, her voice taking on the reasonable tone she'd used when explaining why Mercy couldn't attend church socials or town dances. "You'll have a home, employment, purpose. What more could you ask for?" Love, Mercy thought desperately. Family. To matter to someone. "And this widower?" Constance asked quietly. "He's respectable?" Henderson waved dismissively. "Oh, quite. Caleb Morrison runs a modest ranch about 3 hours' ride from here. Lost his wife in childbirth recently, tragic business, really. He needs someone to care for his daughter and manage his household. Your sister would be performing Christian charity." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that Mercy almost believed it herself. But she could see the truth in Henderson's calculating eyes. This wasn't charity. This was disposal of unwanted goods. Victoria stood and smoothed her skirts, her decision made. "When would this arrangement take place?" "Today, if you're agreeable," Henderson said, already reaching for the coins. "My foreman Jake is waiting outside with a wagon. We could have Mercy settled in her new position before nightfall. Today." The word echoed in Mercy's mind like a death sentence. In a matter of hours, she would be torn away from everything familiar, however cold it had become, and delivered to strangers who wanted her only as unpaid labor. "I'll need a moment to pack her things," Victoria said briskly, as if discussing the sale of an old dress. "Of course," Henderson replied, counting out the coins with obvious satisfaction. "Take all the time you need." But they all knew the truth. Mercy Holloway's life as she'd known it was already over. The metallic clink of coins hitting the wooden table sounded like nails being hammered into a coffin, each piece of silver sealing Mercy's fate with cold finality. Henderson's thick fingers counted out the payment slowly, savoring each moment as Victoria's eyes followed every coin with hungry desperation. "Excellent," Henderson declared, sweeping the remaining coins back into his pouch with theatrical satisfaction. "Jake will have the wagon ready within the hour. I do hope Miss Mercy won't require much time to gather her belongings." Mercy stood frozen in the corner, watching her life dissolve like sugar in rain. The scar on her face throbbed as if freshly carved, a burning reminder of how quickly everything could change. 3 years ago, she'd been the baby of the family, spoiled and protected. Now she was cargo to be shipped away. Mercy doesn't have much, Constance said quietly, unable to meet her youngest sister's eyes. Just some clothes and personal items. Splendid efficiency, Henderson beamed, already moving toward the door. I'll inform Morrison to expect his new household manager by evening. He's quite eager for the assistance, I'm sure. The word manager hung in the air like a bad smell. Everyone in the room knew Mercy wasn't being hired as management. She was being sold as labor, pure and simple. But the polite fiction made the transaction easier for everyone except the girl being traded. After Henderson's carriage rumbled away, silence fell over the tiny house like a burial shroud. Victoria busied herself folding Mercy's few dresses, her movements sharp and efficient. Constance sat at the kitchen table, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. Say something, Mercy whispered, her voice cracking like dry wood. Please, just tell me you're sorry this is happening. Victoria's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their task. I'm doing what's best for all of us. You'll understand someday. Best for all of us? Mercy's voice rose, 3 years of swallowed hurt finally boiling over. Or best for you. When did I stop being your sister and become just a problem to solve? The day that horse kicked you. Victoria whirled around, her beautiful face twisted with ugly emotion. The day you became a constant reminder of everything we lost. Do you think it's easy living with that face staring at me every morning? Remembering Mama and Papa every time I look at you. The words hit Mercy like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at her deepest fears. So there it was, the truth Victoria had hidden behind polite excuses and reasonable explanations. Mercy's scars weren't just ugly. They were painful reminders of their family's destruction. Victoria, stop, Constance said softly, but her voice lacked conviction. No, she needs to hear this, Victoria continued, her control completely shattered now. 3 years I've watched potential suitors walk away because they couldn't stomach looking at her. 3 years of pretending it doesn't matter, that we're still a family. But we're not, are we? We're 3 broken pieces that don't fit together anymore. Mercy touched her scar, feeling its rough texture under her fingertips. I never asked for this to happen to me. And I never asked to be responsible for you, Victoria shot back. But here we are. At least now you'll have a roof over your head and work to do. It's more than many people get. It's more than you deserve, Constance added quietly, her first cruel words cutting deeper than Victoria's shouting. Given everything. The betrayal hit Mercy like ice water. Constance, the gentle sister who'd once braided her hair and sung her lullabies, had just delivered the killing blow with surgical precision. A sharp knock interrupted the emotional carnage. Through the window, Mercy could see a weathered man in work clothes standing beside a plain wooden wagon. This must be Jake, Henderson's foreman, come to collect his cargo. Miss Holloway? Jake called through the door. Time to go if you're ready. Ready. As if anyone could be ready to have their life torn apart and scattered to the wind. Victoria handed Mercy a small carpet bag containing her worldly possessions. 3 dresses, some undergarments, a pair of worn boots, and their mother's silver locket. Everything that remained of 16 years of existence fit into a space smaller than a grocery basket. The locket, Mercy said, surprised. You're letting me keep it? For a moment, Victoria's mask slipped, revealing something that might have been regret. Mama would have wanted you to have it. But the kindness felt hollow, a token gesture that changed nothing about what was happening. Mercy fastened the locket around her neck, feeling its familiar weight settle against her chest like a small anchor to her former life. I'll write, Constance said suddenly, the words tumbling out in a rush. Once you're settled, I'll send letters. They both knew it was a lie. Letters cost money they didn't have, and besides, what would there be to say? How's life as an unpaid servant? Are you still hideously scarred? We're much happier without you. Mercy walked to the door, each step feeling like she was walking toward her own execution. At the threshold, she turned back one last time, memorizing the faces of the sisters who'd raised her after their parents died, who'd fed her and clothed her and taught her to read, who'd just sold her like a piece of unwanted furniture. "Goodbye," she whispered. Neither sister answered. Jake helped her into the wagon with surprising gentleness, his weathered face kind but distant. As the wheels began to turn, Mercy watched the only home she'd ever known shrink into the distance. Victoria and Constance stood in the doorway, not waving, not calling out final farewells, just watching their problem disappear over the horizon. The Wyoming prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, golden grass rippling like an ocean under the afternoon sun. Somewhere out there waited Caleb Morrison and his daughter, strangers who'd paid $50 for the privilege of owning her labor. But as the familiar landmarks faded behind them, Mercy felt something unexpected stirring in her chest alongside the grief and fear. For the first time in 3 years, she was free from the daily reminder that she was unwanted, unloved, a burden too heavy for her family to bear. Maybe, just maybe, being nobody's problem was the first step toward becoming somebody worth knowing. The wagon wheels crunched rhythmically against the dirt road, each turn carrying Mercy further from everything familiar and deeper into unknown territory. Jake hadn't spoken since they'd left Cheyenne, but his silence felt comfortable rather than hostile, the quiet of a man accustomed to long stretches of solitude rather than someone uncomfortable with her presence. "Nervous?" he asked suddenly, his voice gravelly from years of prairie wind and dust. Mercy jumped at the unexpected question, then nodded honestly. "Wouldn't you be?" Jake's weathered face cracked into something resembling a smile. "Reckon I would. Moving to strangers' houses ain't easy, even under the best circumstances. And these aren't the best circumstances," Mercy thought but didn't say. She was purchased goods being delivered, not a welcome guest arriving for a visit. "Tell me about them," she said instead. "The Morrisons." Jake was quiet for so long that Mercy wondered if he'd heard her. The wagon swayed gently as they navigated a particularly rutted section of road, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled lazily above the grassland. "Caleb's a good man," Jake said finally. "Worked for him off and on for 5 years now. Fair boss, pays his debts, treats his animals right. That tells you something about a person's character." "And his wife?" Mercy asked, then immediately felt foolish. "I mean, his late wife. Sarah was special," Jake said, his voice softening with memory. "Had a way of making everyone feel welcome, like they mattered. Could make a feast out of nothing, patch up any hurt, physical or otherwise. When she died," he shook his head. "Well, Caleb ain't been the same since. Neither has little Emma." The mention of the child made Mercy's stomach clench with fresh anxiety. She'd never spent much time around children, having been the youngest in her own family. What if the little girl took one look at her scarred face and ran away screaming? "How old is Emma?" "4 years old, going on 40, Jake replied with genuine fondness. "Smart as a whip, that one. Used to chatter like a magpie, always asking questions, always into everything. Since her mama died, though." He trailed off, leaving the sentence hanging like morning mist. They crested a small hill, and suddenly the Morrison ranch spread before them like something from a storybook. The house was larger than Mercy had expected. 2 stories of weathered wood with a wraparound porch that looked like it had been built for lazy summer evenings. Outbuildings dotted the property. A red barn, a chicken coop, several corrals containing horses that lifted their heads curiously at the approaching wagon. It was beautiful in a simple, honest way that made Mercy's chest tight with unexpected longing. This was what a real home looked like. Not the cramped adobe box she'd shared with her sisters, but a place where a family could grow and thrive. "There's Emma now," Jake said, pointing to a small figure on the porch swing. The little girl was tiny even for her age, with dark curls that caught the afternoon light and enormous brown eyes that seemed to take up half her face. She wore a simple blue dress that was clean but clearly homemade, and she clutched a rag doll with fierce protectiveness. But it was the stillness that struck Mercy most forcefully. Emma sat motionless on the swing, not pumping her legs or spinning in circles or doing any of the restless things children usually did. She simply sat and watched their approach with the patience of someone much older. The front door opened, and Caleb Morrison stepped onto the porch. Mercy's breath caught in her throat. He was nothing like what she'd expected. Not the grizzled old widower of her imagination, but a man probably no older than 30, tall and lean with dark hair that showed premature streaks of silver at the temples. His clothes were simple but well-maintained. Work pants, a clean white shirt, suspenders that spoke of a man who did physical labor but took pride in his appearance. But it was his face that surprised her most. Strong features marked by grief but not hardened by it. Eyes that held depth and intelligence. A mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile but might remember with the right encouragement. When those eyes met hers across the yard, Mercy braced herself for the familiar sequence. Initial curiosity, recognition of her scar, then the quick look away that said more than words ever could. Instead, Caleb Morrison looked at her the way he might assess a horse he was considering buying, practically measuring capability rather than beauty. There was no shock in his expression, no disgust or pity, just quiet evaluation. "Miss Holloway," he said as Jake helped her down from the wagon. His voice was deep and steady, with a hint of education that suggested he'd seen more of the world than this isolated ranch. "I trust the journey wasn't too difficult." "No, sir," Mercy replied, acutely aware of how young and uncertain she sounded. "Thank you for taking me in." The words felt inadequate, but what was she supposed to say? "Thank you for buying me from my sisters? Thank you for giving me somewhere to go when my own family threw me away?" "Emma," Caleb called gently to the child on the swing. "Come meet Miss Mercy." The little girl slid down from the swing with careful precision, her movements deliberate and controlled in a way that seemed unnatural for someone so young. She approached slowly, studying Mercy's face with the frank curiosity that only children possessed. "Does it hurt?" Emma asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the scar. The question was so direct, so innocent, that Mercy almost smiled for the first time all day. "Not anymore, sweetheart. Sometimes old hurts stop hurting, even when they leave marks behind." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her. Then, unexpectedly, she reached out and took Mercy's hand in her tiny one. "Papa said you're going to help take care of me," Emma said. "Mama used to do that, but she went to heaven." The simple statement hit Mercy like a physical blow. Here was another person who'd lost everything. Another soul trying to navigate a world that had suddenly become too big and too empty. "I'd like to help take care of you," Mercy said softly. "If you'd like that." For the first time since Mercy's arrival, Emma's solemn expression brightened slightly. "Do you know any stories?" "I know lots of stories." "Good," Emma declared with the finality of someone making an important decision. "I like stories." Caleb watched this exchange with something that might have been relief flickering across his features. Perhaps he'd been as nervous about this arrangement as Mercy was, wondering if a stranger could fill even a fraction of the enormous hole left by his wife's death. "Let me show you to your room," he said, reaching for Mercy's carpetbag. "You must be tired." As they walked toward the house, Emma's small hand still clasped in hers, Mercy felt the first stirring of something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Maybe this wouldn't be the punishment she'd feared. Maybe, just maybe, these broken people could help each other heal. But first, she had to prove she was worth the $50 they'd paid for her. The screaming started at 2 in the morning, piercing the October darkness like a knife through silk and jolting Mercy awake in her narrow bed. For a confused moment, she thought she was back in Cheyenne, listening to her sisters argue over borrowed ribbon or stolen glances from suitors. Then reality crashed back. She was in the Morrison house now, had been for exactly 12 days, and that wasn't anger echoing through the walls. Emma was having another nightmare. Mercy's bare feet hit the cold wooden floor as she rushed toward the child's room, her nightgown billowing behind her. Through Emma's doorway, she could see the little girl thrashing in her bed, tangled in sheets that had twisted around her like rope. Her face was flushed with fever-bright terror, and she called out words that cut straight through Mercy's heart. Mama! Mama! Don't leave me. I'll be good, I promise. Caleb was already there, kneeling beside the bed with his strong hands hovering helplessly above his daughter. In the lamplight, his face looked haggard and defeated. This was clearly a familiar torture for both father and child. Emma, sweetheart, you're safe, he murmured, his voice rough with exhaustion and worry. Papa's here. You're safe. But Emma couldn't hear him. She was trapped somewhere deeper than sleep, reliving the moment when her mother's heartbeat stopped and her small world shattered beyond repair. Mercy had seen that look before. In her own mirror, the weeks after the accident that took her parents and carved permanent sorrow into her face. Without thinking, Mercy moved to the opposite side of the bed and began humming a lullaby her own mother had sung during thunderstorms. The melody was simple and old, something about sailing away to magical islands where nothing could hurt you. Her voice was nothing special, certainly not as sweet as Victoria's or as trained as Constance's. But it carried love, and sometimes love was the only medicine that worked. Emma's thrashing slowed. Her cries softened to whimpers, then to barely audible sighs. Gradually, her breathing deepened into the rhythm of true rest instead of exhausted collapse. Caleb stared at Mercy across the small bed, his brown eyes wide with something approaching wonder. How did you know to do that? Experience, Mercy said simply, smoothing Emma's dark curls away from her damp forehead. Sometimes the only way out of a nightmare is through music. They stood guard over Emma's sleep for another hour, neither willing to risk another episode by leaving too soon. In the soft lamplight, Mercy found herself studying Caleb's profile, the strong line of his jaw, the way worry lines had carved themselves around his eyes, the gentle way he adjusted Emma's blanket every few minutes. She used to sleep through the night, he said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Before Sarah died, Emma would sleep from sunset to sunrise like the world's most perfect child. Now she's afraid that sleep means losing the people she loves, Mercy finished. It's not uncommon. After my parents died, I used to fight sleep for weeks. I was convinced that if I closed my eyes, Victoria and Constance would disappear too. Caleb's gaze found the scar on her face, but his expression held curiosity rather than revulsion. You were young when you lost them? 13. Old enough to understand death, too young to accept it. And your sisters? How did they help you through the nightmares? The question stabbed deeper than Caleb could know. Mercy remembered those terrible weeks when darkness felt like drowning, when every shadow seemed to whisper threats. Victoria had been busy trying to figure out how 3 orphan girls would survive. Constance had been lost in her own grief. Neither had time for lullabies or patient vigils. They did their best, Mercy said diplomatically. Everyone grieves differently. But Caleb was too intelligent to miss the careful phrasing. His eyes narrowed slightly, and Mercy could practically see him filing away information about her past. She wondered what conclusions he was drawing about sisters who'd sell their youngest sibling to a stranger. I should go back to bed, she said, suddenly uncomfortable under his scrutiny. Tomorrow's bread-baking day. Mercy, his voice stopped her at the doorway. Thank you for helping her sleep. It's why I'm here, she replied. But even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't entirely true anymore. Somewhere in the past 12 days, caring for Emma had stopped feeling like work and started feeling like purpose. Back in her own room, Mercy lay awake watching shadows dance across the ceiling. The Morrison house was full of ghosts. Not supernatural spirits, but the phantom presence of Sarah Morrison, whose touches lingered in every perfectly organized cupboard, every carefully tended flower bed, every photograph that Caleb still couldn't bring himself to put away. Mercy understood why Emma had nightmares. How do you compete with a perfect memory? How do you fill a space left by someone who apparently never made mistakes, never lost her temper, never failed to have dinner ready exactly on time? During her first week at the ranch, Mercy had tried to match Sarah's impossible standards. She'd scrubbed floors until her knees bled, cooked elaborate meals that no one had appetite to appreciate, arranged flowers in vases that Sarah had chosen. But perfection felt like wearing someone else's clothes, uncomfortable and obviously wrong. It was Emma who'd finally shown her a different path. Mama never made cookies shaped like horses, the little girl had observed 3 days ago, watching Mercy roll out dough for sugar cookies. Would you like me to make some horse-shaped ones? Mercy had asked. Emma's nod was so enthusiastic it made her curls bounce. Mama always made circles, but I like horses better. That's when Mercy realized her mistake. She wasn't here to be Sarah Morrison. She was here to be Mercy Holloway, scarred, imperfect, but undeniably present. Emma didn't need a replacement mother. She needed someone who would create new memories instead of trying to recreate old ones. The next morning brought proof that their midnight vigil had worked. Emma woke naturally with the sunrise, stretching like a kitten and announcing her hunger with matter-of-fact directness. "I'm ready for breakfast," she declared, appearing in the kitchen doorway in a nightgown that dragged on the floor. "Good morning to you too, sunshine," Mercy laughed, already mixing batter for pancakes. "Did you sleep well?" "I dreamed about sailing," Emma said, climbing onto a chair with the serious concentration of someone undertaking an important mission. "Like in your song. There were dolphins." "Dolphins are excellent sailing companions," Mercy agreed gravely. "Very trustworthy." Caleb appeared in the doorway, fully dressed for work but moving with the loose-limbed ease of someone who'd actually slept. When he saw Emma chattering happily about dream dolphins, his entire face transformed. For a moment, the grieving widower disappeared, replaced by the father he'd been before loss taught him to expect the worst. "Pancakes?" he asked, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "Horse-shaped pancakes," Emma corrected importantly. "Mercy makes them special." As Mercy served breakfast, she caught Caleb watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Gratitude, certainly, but something deeper too, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time since her arrival. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows and sent leaves spiraling across the yard. Winter was coming to Wyoming, and with it would come the long months when the three of them would be snowed in together, dependent on each other for companionship and comfort. Mercy found herself looking forward to it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, carried by a traveling preacher who knocked on their door just as the first serious snowfall began painting the world white. Mercy was hanging laundry in the kitchen when she heard unfamiliar voices on the front porch, followed by Caleb's measured tones and the sound of boots being stomped clean. "Miss Mercy," Emma called from the front room. "There's a man here with a letter for you." A letter. Mercy's heart jumped like a startled rabbit as she dried her hands on her apron. In the 6 weeks since arriving at Morrison Ranch, she'd received exactly no correspondence from the outside world. Victoria and Constance might as well have ceased to exist the moment Henderson's wagon wheels carried her over the horizon. The preacher was a thin, weathered man with kind eyes and snow melting from his beard. He pulled an envelope from his coat pocket, the paper slightly wrinkled from travel but bearing her name in familiar handwriting. "From your sister in Cheyenne," he explained. "Asked me to make sure this reached you personal-like." Mercy's fingers trembled as she accepted the letter, Victoria's elegant script seeming to mock her from the envelope's surface. Why now? What could Victoria possibly have to say after weeks of silence? "Thank you," she managed, though her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. Caleb offered the preacher hot coffee and a warm meal, which was accepted with grateful enthusiasm. As the two men settled into conversation about weather and road conditions, Mercy escaped to her room with the letter clutched against her chest like armor. The envelope tore easily, revealing 2 sheets of Victoria's expensive writing paper. Another reminder of how differently their lives had diverged since that terrible October day. "Dearest Mercy," the letter began, and already Mercy could taste the lie in those honeyed words. "I hope this letter finds you well and comfortably settled in your new position. Constance and I think of you often and wonder how you're managing your responsibilities. I write with news that I'm certain will interest you greatly. Mr. Henderson and I were married 3 weeks ago in a beautiful ceremony at St. Mary's Church. I wore Mama's pearls and carried roses from Mrs. Patterson's garden. It was everything I had dreamed it would be." Mercy's stomach clenched. Of course, Victoria had worn their mother's pearls, the ones that should have been shared among all three sisters, the ones that represented the last tangible connection to their parents' love. However, I'm afraid I must also share some troubling information. It has come to our attention that your current employer may not be the respectable widower we were led to believe. There are rumors in town about Mr. Morrison's past, suggestions that his wife's death was not entirely natural. Some people whisper about a violent temper, about Sarah Morrison's fear in her final months. The words hit Mercy like physical blows. She read the paragraph twice, then 3 times, trying to make sense of what Victoria was suggesting. Caleb Morrison, violent? The same man who spent 20 minutes each evening reading bedtime stories to his daughter? Who never raised his voice? Who treated even his horses with gentle respect? I feel it is my duty as your sister to warn you of potential danger. Henderson has graciously offered to arrange alternative employment for you, perhaps with a family in Denver where you would be properly supervised and protected. We could have you retrieved within the week if you feel unsafe in your current situation. Of course, this would require returning the $50 that Mr. Morrison paid for your placement, but Henderson assures me this can be managed through his business connections. All you need to do is write back immediately, and we will rescue you from what may be a very dangerous situation indeed. Your loving sister, Victoria Henderson. Mercy's hands shook as she lowered the letter. The timing was too convenient, the concern too sudden. Victoria had sold her without a backward glance. But now, after 6 weeks of silence, she was suddenly worried about Mercy's safety. There had to be another explanation. Something had changed in Cheyenne, something that made Victoria want her youngest sister back under her control. But what? A soft knock interrupted her spiraling thoughts. Mercy! Caleb's voice came through the door, cautious and concerned. The preacher mentioned there might be troubling news in your letter. Is everything all right? Mercy stared at the door, Victoria's accusations ringing in her ears. Violent temper. Sarah Morrison's fear. Death was not entirely natural. How well did she really know the man on the other side of that door? How much did anyone really know about what happened between husband and wife in the privacy of their own home? But then she remembered Emma's easy affection with her father, the way she climbed into his lap without hesitation, sought his comfort during thunderstorms. Children who lived with violence learned to be careful, to watch for warning signs, to make themselves small. Emma Morrison was many things. Grieving, too serious for her age, haunted by loss, but she wasn't afraid of her father. Mercy! Caleb's voice came again, and this time she heard genuine worry threading through the words. She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, his dark eyes searching her face with the same careful attention he gave to sick horses or broken equipment, looking for signs of injury, for problems that needed solving. My sister wrote, she said simply, holding up the letter. She has concerns about my situation here. Caleb's expression grew very still. What kind of concerns? She's heard rumors about your wife's death, about your temperament. The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Mercy watched Caleb's face carefully, looking for flashes of anger, for the violent temper Victoria had warned her about. Instead, she saw something far more devastating. Resignation, as if this wasn't the first time he'd faced such accusations. I see, he said quietly. And what do you believe? The question caught her off guard. He wasn't denying the rumors, wasn't protesting his innocence or demanding her trust. He was simply asking what she thought, as if her opinion mattered more than his reputation. I believe, Mercy said slowly, that people in small towns love to talk, especially about things they don't understand. I believe that sometimes grief makes people say cruel things because they need someone to blame for their pain. Caleb's shoulders relaxed slightly, but the wariness remained in his eyes. Your sister wants you to leave. It wasn't a question, and Mercy nodded. She's offered to arrange alternative employment. In Denver. And what do you want? Again, the simple directness of the question left her speechless. When had anyone last asked what she wanted? Victoria had decided she was too ugly for marriage. Constance had agreed she was too damaged for decent society. Henderson had calculated her market value at $50. But no one had asked what Mercy Holloway actually wanted for her own life. "I want," she said carefully, "to stay here, with you and Emma, if you'll have me, even with the rumors, the questions people might ask." "Let them ask," Mercy said, surprised by the fierce certainty in her own voice. "I know what I've seen. I know how you treat your daughter, how you speak to your animals, how you've treated me. The rest is just noise." For a long moment, they stood looking at each other in the narrow hallway, and Mercy felt something shift between them. A recognition, perhaps, or the beginning of something deeper than mere employer and employee. "Thank you," Caleb said finally, "for trusting your own judgment over gossip." As he turned to go, Mercy made a decision that surprised her with its boldness. "Caleb, the rumors about Sarah's death, what really happened?" He paused at the top of the stairs, his hand gripping the banister. "She hemorrhaged after Emma's birth. I couldn't stop the bleeding, couldn't save her. The doctor said it happens sometimes, that no one was to blame. But when someone young and healthy dies suddenly," he shrugged, "people need explanations. They need someone to be at fault." "I'm sorry," Mercy said softly, "for your loss, and for the cruelty of people who should know better." "So am I," he replied, "but I'm not sorry you're here." After he disappeared downstairs, Mercy sat on her bed and read Victoria's letter one more time. Then she walked to the fireplace and dropped it into the flames, watching her sister's elegant handwriting curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. Outside, the snow continued to fall, sealing them into their small world for the winter months ahead. Mercy had never felt more free. The blizzard struck 3 days before Christmas with the fury of an angry giant, howling across the Wyoming prairie and burying Morrison Ranch under 4 feet of snow that turned the world into a crystal prison. Mercy pressed her face against the kitchen window, watching wind whip the white landscape into dancing spirals that made it impossible to see beyond the front porch. "Storm's getting worse," Caleb announced, stomping snow off his boots as he came in from checking the animals. Ice crystals clung to his dark hair and eyebrows, making him look older than his 30 years. "Good thing we stocked up on supplies last week." Emma looked up from the wooden puzzle she was working on by the fireplace, her small face creased with worry. "Are we trapped, Papa?" "Not trapped, sweetheart," Caleb said gently, though Mercy caught the flicker of concern in his eyes. "Just cozy, like bears in a cave." But Mercy had grown up in Wyoming. She knew the difference between a normal winter storm and the kind of weather that could kill. This blizzard had teeth, and it wasn't planning to let go anytime soon. The first sign of real trouble came that evening when the chimney started smoking back into the house. Caleb climbed onto the roof despite the howling wind, trying to clear the snow buildup that was blocking their only source of heat. Through the window, Mercy could see him moving carefully across the ice-slicked shingles, a dark figure against the white fury of the storm. "He's going to fall," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. Emma appeared beside her, standing on a chair to see out the window. "Papa's careful," she said with 4-year-old confidence. He promised Mama he'd always come back inside. The simple faith in her voice made Mercy's throat tight. Emma had already lost one parent. She couldn't comprehend the possibility of losing another. But Mercy had learned early that promises could be broken by circumstances beyond anyone's control, that careful people still got hurt, that coming back wasn't always a choice you got to make. A crash from above made them both jump. Through the ceiling, they could hear Caleb moving around, followed by the sound of snow sliding off the roof in heavy chunks. Then silence that stretched too long. "Papa," Emma called, her voice small and uncertain. More silence. Mercy's imagination filled with terrible possibilities. Caleb unconscious in a snowdrift, injured and unable to call for help, slowly freezing just yards from safety. Without thinking, she grabbed her coat and headed for the door. "Stay inside," she told Emma firmly. "Keep the fire going." The cold hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her eyes water instantly. The wind was so strong it nearly knocked her off her feet as she struggled around the side of the house, calling Caleb's name into the screaming darkness. "Here," His voice came from somewhere above, strained but alive. "Mercy, go back inside." She looked up to see him hanging from the edge of the roof, his legs dangling over empty air. One of the support beams on the porch had broken under the weight of accumulated snow, leaving him trapped 8 feet above the ground with no safe way down. "Let go!" she shouted over the wind. "I'll catch you. You'll get hurt," he shouted back, but she could hear the fatigue in his voice. He couldn't hold on much longer. Mercy positioned herself beneath him, bracing her feet in the snow and hoping her slight frame could somehow cushion his fall. "Emma needs her father more than she needs me unbroken." For a moment she thought he would refuse. Then his grip loosened and he dropped. The impact knocked them both into the snowdrift, Caleb's weight driving her deep into the soft powder. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't tell which way was up. Then strong hands were pulling her free, brushing snow from her face with urgent gentleness. "Are you hurt?" Caleb's face was inches from hers, his dark eyes wild with concern. "Mercy, talk to me." "I'm fine," she gasped, though every bone in her body felt rattled. "You? Nothing broken." He helped her to her feet, keeping one arm around her waist for support. That was incredibly foolish and incredibly brave. They stumbled back toward the house together, leaning on each other for balance against the wind. Emma met them at the door, her face white with fear that melted into relief when she saw them both safe. "You came back," she said simply, throwing her arms around both of them in a fierce hug that somehow included Mercy without question. Standing there in the warm kitchen, snow melting from their clothes and creating puddles on the floor, Mercy felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't just a job anymore, wasn't just a place to sleep and earn her keep. These people had become her family, chosen rather than born, but real nonetheless. "Hot coffee," she announced, stepping back to shed her wet coat. "And then we figure out how to stay warm until this storm passes." The chimney remained blocked, forcing them to rely on the kitchen stove for heat. They dragged mattresses into the main room and built a fort of blankets around the stove, creating a small pocket of warmth in the increasingly cold house. As the night wore on, they took turns feeding wood into the stove and telling stories to keep Emma's mind off the howling wind. Caleb shared tales of his childhood in Kansas, before he'd come west to build his ranch. Emma contributed elaborate stories about magical horses and brave princesses that made Mercy smile despite their circumstances. "Your turn," Emma said, snuggling closer to Mercy in their makeshift bed. "Tell us about when you were little." Mercy's mind went blank. What stories could she share? The happy memories from before her parents' death felt too precious to expose, while everything after felt too dark for a child's ears. "I had sisters," she said finally. "2 of them. We used to pretend we were explorers, searching for treasure in our backyard." "Did you find any?" Emma asked sleepily. Mercy thought about Victoria and Constance, about the love they'd shared before tragedy turned them against each other, about the family they'd been before fear made them cruel. "Yes," she said softly. "We found each other. That was the best treasure of all." It wasn't entirely true, not anymore, but it had been once. And maybe, Mercy thought as she listened to Emma's breathing slow into sleep, she was finding a new kind of treasure now. Across the nest of blankets, Caleb's eyes met hers in the flickering stove light. "Thank you," he mouthed silently. "For everything." Mercy nodded, suddenly too full of emotion for words. Outside, the storm continued its assault on their small sanctuary. But inside, wrapped in warmth and unexpected belonging, she felt safer than she had in years. The sound of axes biting into wood echoed across the snow-covered yard as neighbors arrived to help clear the storm damage, their voices mixing with the jingle of harnesses and the stamp of horses eager to move after 3 days of confinement. Mercy stood at the kitchen window, watching the small army of ranchers work to restore normalcy to their world, when she spotted an elegant carriage picking its way carefully up the road. Her blood turned to ice water. Even from a distance, she recognized the expensive vehicle, the matched pair of horses, the driver in his fancy livery. Henderson had come calling, and where Henderson went, Victoria was sure to follow. "Caleb," she called, her voice tight with alarm. "We have visitors." He looked up from where he was helping to rebuild the damaged porch, his face instantly alert to the tension in her tone. When he saw the approaching carriage, his expression hardened into something Mercy had never seen before. Not anger exactly, but a quiet, dangerous watchfulness that reminded her he was a man who'd built a successful ranch in hostile territory. "Emma, go inside," he said quietly, not taking his eyes off the carriage. "Stay with Mercy." But Emma had already spotted the fancy vehicle and was bouncing with excitement. "Papa, look at the pretty horses." The carriage drew to a stop in their yard, looking as out of place as a peacock in a chicken coop. Henderson climbed down first, his bulk wrapped in an expensive fur coat that probably cost more than most families earned in a year. Behind him came Victoria, resplendent in emerald green wool with matching gloves and a hat that belonged in a fashion magazine rather than a Wyoming ranch yard. "Mr. Morrison," Henderson called out in his booming voice, ignoring the dozen witnesses scattered around the property. "I trust you weathered the storm without too much difficulty?" Several of the neighboring ranchers had stopped their work to watch this unexpected drama unfold. Word traveled fast in ranch country, and everyone knew about the arrangement that had brought Mercy to Morrison Ranch. Now they stood with tools in their hands and speculation in their eyes, sensing conflict like animals sensing fire. "Mr. Henderson," Caleb replied evenly, making no move to approach the carriage. "What brings you out in such difficult traveling conditions?" Victoria stepped forward, her green eyes scanning the yard until they found Mercy in the kitchen doorway. Even across the distance, Mercy could see the calculating assessment in her sister's gaze. Taking inventory of Mercy's appearance, her obviously comfortable circumstances, the way Emma pressed against her side with unconscious trust. "We've come for my sister," Victoria announced, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "I'm afraid there's been a terrible misunderstanding about her situation here." The word situation dripped with implication, and Mercy felt heat flood her cheeks as she realized what Victoria was suggesting. To anyone listening, it would sound like something improper was happening between her and Caleb, something that required immediate rescue by concerned family. "I'm not sure I understand," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Miss Mercy is employed here as household manager and child care provider. I'm not aware of any misunderstanding." Henderson produced an official-looking document from his coat, waving it like a weapon. "This is a legal guardian transfer, signed by Miss Victoria Henderson as Mercy's eldest sister and legal guardian. It grants us the authority to remove her from what we have determined to be an unsuitable environment." The words hit Mercy like physical blows. Legal guardian? Victoria had never mentioned claiming such authority, had never acted like anything more than an older sister with opinions. But if Henderson had the law on his side— "Show me," Caleb said, extending his hand for the document. As he read, Mercy watched his face grow progressively darker. Whatever was written on that paper, it wasn't good news for their small family. "This appears to be in order," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "Though I question the timing. If Miss Mercy's welfare was truly your concern, why wait 3 months to act?" Victoria's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "We had to gather evidence, naturally. Reports of impropriety. Take time to investigate properly." "What impropriety?" The question came from Jake, who'd been helping to clear snow from the barn roof. His weathered face was flushed with anger, and several other neighbors nodded in agreement. "I've been working this ranch for years, and I ain't never seen anything but proper behavior from Caleb Morrison. The perception of impropriety can be just as damaging as the reality," Henderson replied smoothly. "A young, unmarried woman living alone with a widowed man. Well, I'm sure you understand the concerns of decent society." Mercy felt the trap closing around them like ice. Victoria hadn't come here out of concern for her sister's welfare. She'd come to destroy the happiness Mercy had found, to drag her back into a life of servitude and shame. But why? What had changed to make her want her scarred sister back under her control? Then she saw it. A subtle swell beneath Victoria's fashionable coat, carefully hidden but unmistakable to someone who'd helped birth farm animals. Victoria was pregnant, probably 3 or 4 months along, and suddenly everything made perfect sense. Pregnant wife would need help. Someone to manage the household during difficult months, to care for the baby when it arrived, to take on the duties that Victoria's elevated social position now made beneath her. And who better than a sister who owed everything to Victoria's charity? "I see," Mercy said aloud, stepping out into the yard despite Caleb's sharp look of warning. "Congratulations on your pregnancy, Victoria. When is the baby due?" Victoria's face went white, then red. Around the yard, the assembled ranchers exchanged knowing looks. They'd all seen this particular drama play out before in various forms. "I don't know what you're suggesting," Victoria said stiffly, but her hand moved instinctively to her stomach. "I'm suggesting that you need unpaid help for the next year or 2, Mercy replied, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Someone to scrub floors while you rest, to tend the baby while you attend social functions, to be grateful for the privilege of serving you. But I'm not that person anymore." "You ungrateful little—" Victoria started forward, her composure finally cracking completely. "Enough." Caleb's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Miss Mercy is of legal age and can make her own decisions about where she lives and works. If she chooses to leave, that's her right. But she won't be forced." He turned to Mercy, his dark eyes serious and searching. "The choice is yours. You can go with your sister if that's what you want. Or you can stay here, as part of our family. Our family." The words hit Mercy like sunrise after the longest night. Not his employee, not his burden, not the scarred girl no one else wanted. Family. "I choose to stay," she said clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is my home now." Victoria's face twisted with fury and something that might have been desperation. "You can't. I won't allow it." "You don't have a choice," Jake called out, grinning broadly. "Mercy's 18 years old, legal age to make her own decisions. That paper of yours ain't worth the ink it's printed with." Henderson's face had gone an interesting shade of purple as he realized his legal threat had just evaporated in front of a dozen witnesses. Victoria looked around the yard, seeking support from faces that ranged from openly hostile to merely unsympathetic. "You'll regret this," she said finally, her voice shaking with rage. "Both of you." As the carriage rolled away, taking Victoria's threats and Henderson's bluster with it, Mercy felt something she'd never experienced before. The absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. Emma slipped her small hand into Mercy's and squeezed tight. "Are they going to come back?" "Maybe," Mercy said honestly. "But if they do, we'll face them together." "All 3 of us?" Emma asked. Mercy looked at Caleb, seeing her own determination reflected in his steady gaze. "All 3 of us," she confirmed. And for the first time since the horse kick that had changed everything, Mercy Holloway felt truly beautiful. The church bells of Cheyenne were ringing for Sunday service when the first fence post exploded into splinters, the crack of the rifle shot echoing across Morrison Ranch like thunder on a clear day. Mercy dropped the bucket of chicken feed she'd been carrying, her heart hammering as she scanned the tree line for the source of the attack. "Get down!" Caleb's voice roared from somewhere near the barn, and Mercy threw herself behind the water trough just as a second shot rang out, this bullet striking the ground where she'd been standing moments before. Emma. The thought hit Mercy like ice water. Where was Emma? The little girl had been playing on the front porch just minutes ago, chattering to her rag doll about tea parties and magical kingdoms. Now the porch stood empty, the child's toys scattered across the wooden planks like abandoned promises. "Emma!" Mercy called, keeping low as she crawled toward the house. "Emma, where are you?" "I'm in the root cellar," came a small voice from beneath the kitchen floor. "Papa taught me to hide here when there's trouble." Relief flooded through Mercy so powerfully it left her weak. At least Emma was safe, hidden in the underground storage room that Caleb had reinforced specifically for emergencies like this. But who was shooting at them and why? Another shot shattered the kitchen window, sending glass cascading across the floor like deadly rain. This wasn't random violence. Someone was specifically targeting the Morrison family, trying to terrorize them into submission or worse. Mercy! Caleb's voice came from behind the barn. Can you make it to the house? I'm here, she called back. Emma's safe in the cellar. Stay there. Keep your head down. From her position behind the trough, Mercy could see movement in the cottonwood trees that lined the creek. 3 men on horseback, their faces hidden by bandanas but their intent clear from the rifles in their hands. They weren't trying to kill, not yet, but they were sending a message as sharp as their bullets. Leave, now, or next time we won't miss. A 4th shot took out the weather vane on top of the barn, the metal rooster spinning wildly before crashing to the ground. These weren't random drifters or cattle thieves. This was planned, calculated, designed to drive them away without technically committing murder in broad daylight. Henderson. The name hit Mercy with grim certainty. Victoria's husband had the money to hire gunmen, the connections to avoid legal consequences, and the motivation to want them gone. If he couldn't force them to leave through legal means, he'd find other ways to make their lives unbearable. You folks got until sunset to pack up and move on. The voice came from the trees, harsh and unfamiliar. Next time we come calling, we won't be so polite. The sound of hoofbeats retreated toward town, leaving behind a silence that felt more threatening than the gunshots had been. Mercy waited several minutes before emerging from her hiding spot, every muscle tense with the expectation of another attack. Caleb appeared from behind the barn, his face grim and his rifle ready. Are you hurt? No, but they weren't trying to hurt us, Mercy said, brushing dirt from her skirt. They were trying to scare us. It worked. Emma's voice came from the kitchen as she climbed out of the root cellar, her face pale but determined. But I'm not scared enough to leave. Caleb knelt beside his daughter, checking her for injuries with gentle hands. That's my brave girl. But we need to be smart about this. Whoever hired those men won't give up after one warning. Mercy walked to the shattered window, her mind racing through possibilities. Running would be the smart choice. Pack up and disappear before the next attack, find somewhere safe to start over. But running would also mean letting Henderson win, letting Victoria reclaim control over her life through fear and violence. They'll be back, she said quietly. Probably tonight, when they think we'll be most vulnerable. Then we'll be ready for them, Caleb replied. But Mercy could hear the doubt underneath his determination. 3 people against professional gunmen weren't good odds, especially with a 4-year-old to protect. There's another option, Mercy said slowly, an idea forming in her mind. What if we weren't here when they came back? Caleb frowned. You want to run? I want to visit town, Mercy corrected. All 3 of us. Tonight. Let Henderson's men find an empty house and wonder where we've gone. That's not a long-term solution, Caleb pointed out. We can't live in town forever. No, but we can make some noise while we're there, Mercy said, her plan crystallizing with each word. Let people know what Henderson's doing, how he's using violence to steal our land. Public opinion is a powerful weapon if you know how to use it. Emma tugged on Mercy's skirt. Are we going to fight the bad men? We're going to be smarter than the bad men, Mercy corrected gently. Sometimes being smart is better than being strong. As they packed essential supplies into the wagon, Mercy caught herself thinking about Victoria, probably sitting in her fancy parlor at that very moment, unaware that her husband's hired guns had just terrorized a 4-year-old child. Did Victoria know what Henderson was capable of? Did she care? The ride to Cheyenne took 2 hours, plenty of time for Mercy to refine her strategy. She directed Caleb to the boarding house on Main Street, a respectable establishment run by Mrs. Patterson, a widow who'd known Mercy's parents and had always shown kindness to the Orphan sisters. Mercy Holloway, Mrs. Patterson exclaimed as they climbed the front steps. What brings you to town, dear? And with such a lovely family. The older woman's eyes lingered on Emma with obvious delight, then moved to Caleb with the appraising look of someone evaluating marriage prospects. Mercy felt heat flood her cheeks at the implication, but she didn't correct Mrs. Patterson's assumption. We need rooms for the night, Mercy said. There's been some trouble at the ranch. Mrs. Patterson's expression sharpened with concern and curiosity. What kind of trouble? The kind that involves men with rifles and threats about leaving town, Caleb said quietly. The kind that puts children in danger. Within minutes, word was spreading through the boarding house like wildfire. Mrs. Patterson was the unofficial news center of Cheyenne, and nothing happened in her establishment without the entire town knowing about it by morning. By the time they'd settled into their rooms, 3 other guests had already stopped by to offer sympathy and ask pointed questions about who might want to drive the Morrison family away. Henderson, Mrs. Patterson said finally, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. That man's been buying up properties all over the county, making offers people can't refuse. Your ranch would give him control of the entire northern water supply. But we're not selling, Emma piped up from where she sat on the bed, hugging her rag doll. Our house is perfect just the way it is. Mrs. Patterson's face softened as she looked at the little girl. Of course it is, sweetheart. And nobody should have to leave their home because of bullies. That evening, as they sat in the boarding house dining room, Mercy watched the other guests carefully. Word of their situation had spread, and she could see the calculation in people's faces as they processed the implications. Henderson wasn't just threatening one family. He was setting a precedent that could affect any landowner who stood in his way. Mr. Morrison, called out a grizzled rancher from across the room. Heard you had some uninvited visitors today. 3 men with rifles, Caleb confirmed. Told us to be gone by sunset. And what did you tell them? Caleb's smile was sharp as a blade. We told them we'd think about it. From the safety of town, where there are plenty of witnesses. Laughter rippled through the dining room, and Mercy felt the first stirring of hope. Public shame was Henderson's weakness. His entire power base depended on maintaining a respectable facade. If the whole town knew he was using hired guns to terrorize families. Shame how some folks think money gives them the right to push decent people around, Mrs. Patterson said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Good thing we've got a sheriff who believes in protecting law-abiding citizens. Sheriff Hayes happened to be sitting at the next table, and his weathered face creased into a knowing smile. That's right, Mrs. Patterson. Real shame when someone has to leave their own home because of varmints on their property. The message was clear. Henderson's hired guns had just become a law enforcement problem, not a private dispute. And unlike isolated ranch attacks, anything that happened in town would have dozens of witnesses. As they prepared for bed, Emma asked the question that had been weighing on all their minds. Are we going home tomorrow? Mercy looked at Caleb, seeing her own determination reflected in his steady gaze. Yes, sweetheart. We're going home. And this time, we're going to make sure nobody tries to chase us away again. The sun was painting the eastern sky gold and pink when they crested the hill overlooking Morrison Ranch, and Mercy's heart lurched at the sight that greeted them below. Smoke was rising from behind the barn, not the gentle curl of a kitchen chimney, but the thick, angry black of something important burning. The hay barn, Caleb said grimly, urging the horses into a gallop. 6 months' worth of winter feed going up in flames. They raced down the slope with Emma clinging to Mercy's arm, the acrid smell of burning grass growing stronger with each stride. As they drew closer, the full scope of the damage became clear. Henderson's men hadn't been content with just threats. They'd come back during the night and struck where it would hurt most. Papa, look, Emma whispered, pointing toward the house. Every window had been smashed, the front door hung crooked on its hinges, and someone had painted ugly words across the white clapboard siding in red paint that looked disturbingly like blood. The message was clear. This is what happens when you don't listen. But there were other figures moving around the property, neighbors from surrounding ranches, working together to contain the fire and assess the damage. Jake was organizing a bucket brigade while Mrs. Thompson from the adjacent property swept glass from the front porch. Word of last night's threats had traveled fast, and the community was responding. Caleb, Sheriff Hayes emerged from behind the house, his badge glinting in the morning light. Glad to see you're all safe. We got here about an hour ago when Mrs. Thompson saw the smoke. How bad is it? Caleb asked, though his face suggested he already knew the answer. Barn's a total loss, but we saved the house. Whoever did this was thorough. They knew exactly what would cause the most damage without technically committing arson on a dwelling. Professional work, in other words. Henderson had hired men who knew how to destroy lives without crossing legal lines that might bring serious consequences. Any witnesses? Mercy asked, helping Emma down from the wagon. 3 riders, faces covered, gone before anyone could get close enough for identification, Hayes replied. But we found something interesting. He held up a silver button, expensive and distinctive, with an ornate H engraved in the center. Fell off when one of them was climbing through the kitchen window. Recognize it. Mercy's breath caught. She'd seen buttons exactly like that on Henderson's finest jacket, the one he wore to important business meetings and social functions. Either he'd been personally involved in the attack, or he'd given his coat to someone else to wear. Either way, it was evidence of his connection to the violence. That's from Henderson's formal jacket, she said. I've seen him wear it to church. Sheriff Hayes' smile was grim with satisfaction. Funny how evidence has a way of turning up when you know where to look. As the day progressed, more neighbors arrived to help with repairs. The community response was overwhelming. Women brought food and offers to host Emma while the cleanup continued. Men arrived with lumber and tools to rebuild what had been destroyed. Henderson had thought to isolate them, to make them feel helpless and alone. Instead, his attack had galvanized the entire region against him. He made a mistake, Mrs. Thompson observed as she helped Mercy salvage dishes from the wreckage of the kitchen. Gerald Henderson's always been careful to keep his hands clean, to let others do his dirty work while he maintained plausible denial. But this was too personal, too vicious. People are talking. What kind of talking? Mercy asked, sweeping broken glass into a dustpan. The kind that happens when decent folks realize they might be next if somebody doesn't take a stand. Henderson's got plans for half the ranches in this county. And if he can drive you out with violence. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the implications. Today it was Morrison Ranch. Tomorrow it could be any of them. Caleb found Mercy as the sun was setting, both of them exhausted from a day of salvaging and cleaning. Emma was asleep in Mrs. Thompson's wagon, worn out from excitement and stress. The house is livable, he reported. Most of the damage was superficial, meant to frighten rather than destroy. But the barn, he shook his head. That's going to take months to rebuild, and we lost most of our winter feed. How bad is it financially? Mercy asked, though she dreaded the answer. Bad enough. Between replacing the feed and rebuilding the barn, we're looking at more debt than the ranch can carry. Unless we have a perfect spring and summer. He didn't need to finish. They both understood what he was saying. Henderson might get his victory after all, not through violence but through simple economics. Sometimes financial pressure was more effective than bullets. There's something else, Caleb continued, his voice carefully neutral. I had a visitor while you were in the house. Victoria Henderson. Mercy's blood turned to ice. She came here? Today? About an hour ago. Said she wanted to see the damage for herself, to make sure you hadn't been hurt in the incident. And Caleb's expression was unreadable. She made an offer. $50,000 for you to come work for her permanently, plus enough money to cover our losses from the fire. All we have to do is agree that you belong with her, that this whole arrangement was a mistake from the beginning. The number hit Mercy like a physical blow. $50,000 was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Enough to rebuild the ranch twice over and still have plenty left for Emma's future. All Victoria wanted in exchange was Mercy's freedom, her happiness, her chosen family. What did you tell her? Mercy asked, though her heart was already racing with fear of his answer. I told her, Caleb said slowly, that the decision wasn't mine to make, that if you wanted to leave, you were free to go. But if you wanted to stay. He paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. I told her that you were part of this family now, and family doesn't abandon each other when times get hard. Mercy felt tears prick her eyes. After everything, the fire, the threats, the financial ruin, he was still choosing her, still believing she was worth more than money could buy. And what do you want, Mercy? He asked gently. $50,000 could solve a lot of problems. She looked around at the damaged ranch, at the neighbors still working to help them rebuild, at Emma sleeping peacefully in the wagon. This place had given her something she'd never had before. Not just love, but the chance to love others in return, to be needed and valued for who she was rather than tolerated despite her flaws. "I want to stay," she said firmly. "I want to fight. And I want to show Henderson that some things can't be bought or burned or threatened away." Caleb's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "Then we'd better figure out how to save this ranch." As if summoned by their determination, Sheriff Hayes approached with something that looked almost like a smile creasing his weathered features. "Folks," he said, "I think you might want to hear what I just learned about Mr. Henderson's business practices. Seems he's been making some very interesting financial arrangements that the territorial government might find educational." For the first time since the shooting had started, Mercy felt hope blooming in her chest like wildflowers after rain. The battle for Morrison Ranch was far from over, but they were no longer fighting it alone.